As we gather this evening on this holiest and most somber day of memory, I'd like to begin by inviting you to take a deep breath in and out. And if you will, allowing evening to fall and allowing your heart to settle, focus your heart and your soul and your mind on this essential act of remembering, to remember. When we hear this word in its two separate parts, our sacred task this evening is clear. We are here to remember, to stitch together memories and reflections from their individual parts back into an inclusive whole, so that we might begin to confront and name the staggering enormity of all who were lost, of all that was lost, of all that was wrought, of evil made manifest in destruction. The psalmist declared, "Eternal One, I will remember your name throughout the night." We are here to remember, to count ourselves as a community of witnesses, of those who accept upon ourselves the responsibility to never forget. We are members. We are members of a community that spans generations, that spans the globe. Those of us who are touched by the Shoah and who will never be the same because of it. Ne'ir Adonai Nishmat Adam. Each one of us. Each human soul is a refraction of the light of the One. And so finally, we are here to remember. We are here to recall the vibrancy of each individual life cut short, each soul extinguished, each breath stopped. To remember lives lost is to honor the One who brought us into being, and to recognize that their loss was a diminishment of the light of the universe. And so we pray, Holy One of Being, may our world learn. May we learn. May we remember that we all emanate from a single source of creation. We all are interconnected, and our lives are in each other's hands as much as they are in yours, O Eternal One of Being. May we, through our remembrance today, be sources of shalom, be sources of peace and wholeness in this troubled world. May we learn. May we learn that human beings can bring evil upon one another. And they can also bring caring and comfort and love. May we promise. May we promise that our time together this evening will inspire us to be sources of goodness and sources of light. Our program tonight will focus on voices. You've already heard the voice of the piano of Michael Alfera and the violin of Janice Mautner. And you'll next hear from one of our TIOH high school students, Emma Blankstein. And Emma will tell you a bit of her own story and introduce tonight's speaker, Erika Fabian, who is a survivor of the Holocaust, of the Shoah, and a woman of deep accomplishment. And we'll also be joined tonight by Rabbi Missaghieh and Shelly Fox, and TIOH members Susan Weil and Anatole Klebanow and their children, Sam and Galina. Anatole, every year, helps us to plan our Holocaust commemoration, along with his wife, Susan, in honor of his parents who were survivors. And tonight we gather so that we might remember to never forget. Emma.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Rabbi Jocee, for your warm words of introduction and your invitation to be a part of this beautiful and important commemoration of Yom HaShoah. My personal journey of honoring, learning from, and engaging with the Holocaust survivor community began right here at TIOH 4 years ago at the Yom HaShoah event. It was that April day that I first met Dorothy Greenstein, a child survivor from Poland. As Dorothy, dressed in a multitude of bright colors, shared her story of escaping the Holocaust by her own ingenuity and perseverance, I was completely captivated. I had to know more. I introduced myself to her after the program and learned that she lived close by to me and was a teacher. We became fast friends, and she later helped me prepare for the Hebrew portion of my bat mitzvah later that year. As I began to visit with Dorothy regularly, I learned about her family, her life before the Holocaust, what it was like trying to survive, and how that experience impacted her later in life. She shared with me her feelings, her strong opinions, and her hopes. Her deep empathy, humility, understanding, tolerance, and huge heart truly moved me. It transformed me. I began to work with the Holocaust Museum of Los Angeles immediately, hoping that I could help others know Dorothy's story and the stories of other survivors. Dorothy and I worked together to create prompts to facilitate conversations between young people and survivors for the museum's Lado Vado program, where students and survivors make challah together while having conversations. As I got to know other survivors as well, I knew there was more for me to do. In the summer of 2018, I had the opportunity to create a short film about Dorothy. She saw the film in October of that year, and I was so proud when she said it was the most accurate telling of her story she had participated in. She passed away just a couple of months later. I have since made 4 films and brought the museum's filmmaking program to my school. As a member of the museum's teen board, we are committed to sharing the stories of survivors and working to combat anti-Semitism through Holocaust education under the leadership of Julia Davis, who is here tonight. Since the pandemic hit, we've joined weekly with survivors for Shabbat over Zoom. Every day, I know it is both a privilege to learn from survivors and a necessity to honor their experiences and legacy. Their pain, perseverance, and wisdom and understanding can guide us to a better place of compassion and love for all people. As Dorothy repeatedly told me, to hate is a heavy thing on your heart, and you have to make your heart light. Right now, our world needs the light of our survivors more than ever, and tonight we have the special honor to hear from Erika Fabian, a child survivor from Hungary and an accomplished writer, director, dancer, actress, playwright, and photographer. Erika will share with us the stories of her early life in Hungary and survival. Afterwards, she came to the United States when she was my age, not knowing a word of English. But that didn't stop her. In fact, nothing has stopped Erika. She has enjoyed a rich and successful career as an award-winning globetrotting photojournalist, has had nearly 200 articles published in a variety of magazines worldwide, published 22 books, and leads art workshops at the museum focused on photography. She's the proud mother of 2 children, a leading LASIK eye surgeon, and an award-winning filmmaker, and 3 loving grandchildren. Please welcome everyone, Erika Fabian.
So, okay. Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me?
We can hear you perfectly, Erika. Thank you so
Okay.
much. And you'll find that everyone's muted, so you couldn't hear the applause, but the applause was big. And we're so very grateful that you're here with us this evening.
Thank you. No need to applaud. You know, when I was told that I have 20 minutes to tell my story, I kept thinking about which are the most important parts. And I guess tonight, because it's Yom HaShoah, the most important part of my life was the fact that I survived World War II as a Jew. But it started out actually I was born in 1940 in Hungary, in the capital, to a very well-to-do family. But my father was taken into a work labor camp when I was 3 years old in 1943, and that was the last time I ever saw him. He was taken from the labor camp to Bergen-Belsen, and we only learned after the war that he had died in Bergen-Belsen. In the meantime, my mother was left with my sister, who in 1944 was 7 years old, and I was 4. We had to move out of our apartment. We had to move to a building that was designated only for Jews, with a big yellow star on the front gate as you walked in. And we had an apartment there, a small apartment. And my very first memory when I look back on the war was waking up about 3 or 4 in the morning to kicking somebody was kicking and banging on our front door of this apartment. And we heard him shouting, "Get dressed, go downstairs." And then we heard a loudspeaker which said, "Everyone gather 2-3 days worth of food and some warm clothing and come downstairs to the courtyard." Hungarian buildings are constructed so that when you come in, you can go straight ahead to a courtyard, which is for gatherings, or go upstairs by stairs or elevators to your apartment. We were on the first floor in this new building, or building new to us, and so we could hear everything. So my mother jumped out of bed and said, we all slept in the same room, of course, in one big bed, and said, "Okay, let's get dressed and get some food and let's go." My sister jumped out of bed, grabbed my mother's legs with her arms and said, "We're not going." And my mother looked at her and said, "What, are you crazy? What do you mean we're not going? You know what's going to happen if they break the door down," because they were still banging on the door. And my sister whispered, they were whispering. I was in bed terrified, and I was just listening to them. And my sister said, "I don't care. I know what's going to happen to us." We all knew that if they break the door down and we're in bed, they're going to shoot us. So there they were in the middle of the room, and all of a sudden the banging on the door stopped. And we could hear downstairs, all the people were gathering there, and we could hear the noise. And then we started hearing feet shuffling out of the building. And within a very short time, nobody was in the building. There was this absolute silence. And my mother and my sister stood frozen in the middle of the room. And my mother said, "They left." And my sister released her legs, which she was holding on to. And my mother said, "We're going to have to leave the building. But right now, let's go back to bed and sleep until a little bit later when we can leave." Because like I said, it was 5 o'clock in the morning. So we slept a couple of hours, and then we got dressed and gathered, just like they said, a couple of pieces of warm clothing. In fact, she told us to wear 2 or 3 things, layer our clothing. And she gathered all the food she could that would be able to be transported. And we had 3 little briefcases, one for each of us. And we went downstairs. But as we were walking toward the front door, there was a banging again on the door, and a shadow fell on the glass window in the middle of the door, and we froze. And then we heard our neighbor, a little old man who lived next door to us, and I'll never know why he didn't leave, but he said, "Mrs. Fabian, open the door." So my mother opened the door, and he said, "I was the one who told the Nazis that you had left already. That's why they stopped banging on your door." So in effect, he saved our lives. And like I said, I don't know why he didn't leave. Maybe he was Christian, I don't know. But he said, "Where are you going?" Because he saw we were leaving. And my mother said, "I don't know yet, but we'll have to find a place, maybe the ghetto." And he said, "No, there is a Swedish safe house that just opened up by the Danube. Why don't you go there?" And he gave my mother the address. Now, Swedish safe houses were set up by Wallenberg, a Swedish diplomat who happened to be in Hungary during this time. And he came from a very wealthy family. So he bought up a number of villas and apartment buildings and declared them under the protectorship of Sweden. And anybody who was in those houses was protected by the Swedish government. We were honorary Swedish citizens. And you could get a Swedish safe pass from the Swedish consulate, or through Wallenberg, or through the Jewish underground, of which apparently there was a flourishing underground, and they created these safe passes, falsified safe passes, but they worked. So we had these. So we thanked the man and went downstairs and left the building, not until the concierge of the building opened the gate for us and I saw that my mother shook hands with him and something passed between them. Obviously, my mother was giving him some money to not tell anybody that we were still alive or we had not gone with the group. So we walked out in the street and it was very cold. It was October, and Hungary in October it has full winter weather. It started to snow, and my mother stopped and thought about this, and she said, finally, she said, okay, let's go to the safe house, but I have to make a call. She had to call her girlfriend, whose name was Irene, because Irene was supposed to come to our house that day, so my mother could go to a village in Hungary and pick up Christian documentation, Christian birth certificates for us. Earlier, what happened was that we used to have a maid who could not work for us anymore because Christians couldn't work for Jews. But before she left to go back to her village, she told my mother if my mother needed anything, she should get in touch with her. So when my father was taken to a concentration camp, or we knew he wouldn't come back, my mother wrote to her and sent her money. And she wrote back and said, we have birth certificates for you, your two daughters, and your friend Irene, approximate correct ages, because she had a large family. So they took birth certificates and put our name in there put their relatives' name in there and our ages. And my mother sent pictures. So I don't know how she did it, but anyway, we had these birth certificates, and my mother was supposed to go and get them, which was a day's train ride to her village. And now we didn't have any place. We didn't have our apartment to stay in. So she called Irene and asked her to meet us at the safe house. And sure enough, Irene showed up. We got there and we went upstairs, and there was this big, beautiful empty room, like a ballroom it was like a very large private villa. And Irene said, oh, how nice, let's settle in. Nobody's here yet. And my mother saw a little door on the side and looked in there, opened it, looked in there, and it was a pantry. And it had a window. And more importantly, it had a sink with running water. And she said to Irene, this is where we're going to stay. And Irene said, why? Look at this room. And my mother said, wait. So we went into the room and settled in, and she closed the door. And by the afternoon, that room next door to us was so full that we couldn't walk through it without worrying about stepping on somebody on our way to the bathroom, which was outside in the hall. It was full of children, adults, old people, young people. Everybody who had been chased out of their house and knew about this place would come there. So we settled in, and it turned out that not only we had food in our little briefcases, but Irene also brought food. So we even had supper and went to sleep. And my mother said if all went well, the next morning she would go to the village and Irene could stay with us in that room in the safe house. Well, about 3 or 4 in the morning, we hear a noise next door. We hear a loudspeaker, which says, everybody hand over their safe passes and they'll get them back. We'll get them back in the morning. And the first thing my mother said was, we're not handing over our safe passes. We have no idea who these people are, and we're not handing it over. She always had a little notebook. So she tore some pieces of paper out of it and made it the size of the safe passes. And when they knocked on the door and shouted, safe passes, she handed those pieces of paper over. And she figured the room was so crowded next door to us that whoever was collecting wasn't going to check whether it was right or not. But as soon as the room quieted down next door and the people had left, she said, we have to leave in the morning. There's no way we can stay here because nobody has their safe passes now. And when they discovered that there were 4 safe passes that were actually just pieces of paper and they'll identify us, we're going to be in big trouble. So early in the morning, we gathered ourselves together. We actually had a piece of bread before leaving and some water, and went through the big room, went downstairs, and my mother knocked on the concierge's door, and he was surprised. And he said, Mrs. Fabian, what are you doing? And she said, oh, we have to leave, I'm sorry. And she handed him again a handshake with some money, and he let us out. It began to snow, and we were standing in the middle of the street and not knowing where we were going to go. And then my mother said, oh, I have an idea. So she took us across the city with streetcars and buses and across a bridge over the river Danube, which divides the city into 2, to the other side of the city, which is the side called Buda. Pashti is the flat side. Buda has hills. And in Buda lived mostly very wealthy people on the hillside in villas. And she said, I know where we're going. And in the increasingly heavy snowfall, we were walking and walking, and finally up the hill. And we got to this big, beautiful wrought iron gate, I remember. And she knocked on the gate and rang the bell. And the man came out still in his pajamas. And he said, Mrs. Fabian, what are you doing here? And then he saw us. And he said, come in, come in. So we went into his house. He turned out to be a doctor, a chief surgeon, actually, who was a friend of my father. They used to rowboat together from Budapest to Vienna. They belonged to a rowing club. My father was a big sportsman. So he heard our story, and he said, I can only take Irene with me to the hospital, and she could work there as an orderly till you get back. But the children would have to go to the Red Cross hospital and pretend to be sick because I don't have any room for children in my hospital. So that's what we did. My mother took us to the Red Cross hospital. And on the way, on the streetcar, on our way, she drilled us that we had to pretend to be sick, which wasn't too difficult. I could always pretend that I had a stomach ache. My sister always had a cold. So we were accepted in the hospital and put into bed next to each other. And this was a huge room with beds lining the walls on 2 sides, and the middle of the room was left for doctors and nurses to come in and take care of us. So they came in, they checked us out. We didn't have any temperature, they said, but yes, my sister was coughing very hard, and I was saying that I have a very upset stomach. So they left us alone. They must have suspected something, but there we were. So that day, because I was only 4 years old, I was rather restless and bored. So to calm me down, my sister started telling me fairy tales. And pretty soon, all the kids who weren't too sick to get out of bed gathered around our beds. And my sister spent the day telling stories to everybody. And we went to sleep. And the next day, the same thing happened. My sister was telling stories most of the day. And by evening, I said to her, Mother was supposed to come back today. Do you think something is wrong? Or how is she going to find us here? And my sister, who didn't know any more than I did, said, shut up or I'll hit you. I don't know. Go to sleep. I think she was just as scared as I was. So this was her way of handling it. That night, again, in the middle of the night, and I have to tell you, to this day, I hate getting up early in the morning. The nurses came into the room and said, everybody get dressed in all your clothes and put on your shoes. And they brought us hot soup, which was breakfast, and a piece of bread. And after you finish your soup and bread, everybody has to come downstairs and gather in front of the building. My sister, Judith, said, don't eat your bread, put it in your briefcase. I'll share my bread because I don't know where they're taking us and I don't know whether we're going to have food or not. And throughout my life, I always carry food with me, by the way, because of various experiences throughout my life where this came in very handy. Anyway, I did what she told me. We had our soup, we had her bread, we went downstairs and we were lined up against the wall in twos so that we looked like in a row. And once everybody was downstairs, all the kids and nurses were out of the building, there were Nazi soldiers standing on the street watching all this and lining us up. And they said, okay, everyone here, move. And this was barely, the sun wasn't out because the sun in the winter in Hungary doesn't come out until about 10 or 11 in the morning and sets at 4. But this was way before that, must have been, I don't know, 7 or 8 in the morning. It was very cold. And shortly after we started to walk, it started to rain. So we were getting soaking wet. And we were walking and walking and walking and walking some more. And they didn't stop with us. Even some of the kids who couldn't walk anymore kind of fell by the wayside. And as an adult now, I could only presume that they were shot because they weren't going to be carried anywhere. But those of us who could walk just walked all day long. At some point, my sister took my briefcase and carried it because I wanted to throw it away. And it was a horrible, horrible experience walking. And finally, it got dark. And not too long after it got dark, we arrived at a big building and were told to go inside. There was a room at the start of the building with a guard, and beyond him was another door, and we were told to go through that door, and we entered a warehouse that was actually already filled with children, and children of all ages, like my age, 4, and maybe even younger, all the way to teenagers, no adults. And we looked around and I said to my sister, where are we going to go here? It's full. She said, come. She walked us through the entire room to the back wall and made room for us. She was kind of aggressive and people kind of moved out of her way. And we sat down with our backs kind of toward the wall, supporting ourselves with our briefcases in the back. And she whispered to me to just keep very quiet. And then once it got later, like, I don't know how long we sat there, they came in and they said, we weren't going to get any supper, but that we will get breakfast in the morning. So when it got dark and most kids fell asleep and it became very quiet in the room, my sister whispered to me and said, now we can eat our bread. So at least we won't go to bed hungry, or we won't fall asleep hungry. And we fell asleep, and very early in the morning, the door opened and a Nazi officer stood in the doorway and called our names. He said, Judith and Erika, Fabian, come here. And we both woke up. And I said to Judith, let's not go. He's a Nazi. He's going to kill us. And my sister whispered back, don't be stupid. We're the only ones he's calling. Get up and let's go. So she made me go and walk through all those kids. And we got to the door. And she said, I'm Judith, and this is Erika, Fabian. He said, don't say a word, come with me. We followed him out the door. He took us over to the officer who sat guard and said, these kids were brought here by mistake. Here are their papers. And he handed the officer some papers. The officer shrugged. He said, sign for them. He didn't care. And the Nazi signed for us and said, come. We went outside and he said, I'm going to take you on 2 or 3 streetcars. And I want you to keep very quiet, no talking at all. Don't ask any questions, just come with me. And he helped us by carrying our briefcases and helped us get on this first streetcar. We sat down with him. And sure enough, there were a lot of Nazis on the streetcar besides people who were going to work. So we knew to keep quiet. And we switched streetcars from one to another and then another. And we got off. And then we walked, I don't know how many streets and in and out of buildings. And finally, we got to a building and we walked in and he knocked on the concierge's door and opened the door, and my mother was there. What happened was that when my mother got back from the village with all the necessary birth certificates, she went over to the Red Cross building to pick us up and saw two Nazis standing guard at the door. And she said, she immediately knew that something was wrong. And she said, "What's this building?" And one of the Nazis, my mother was a very attractive young woman with sort of a auburn hair and turned up nose. She didn't look Jewish, so they didn't suspect that she was Jewish, but they said to her, "Are you looking for a child here?" This was a Red Cross hospital full of Jewish children, but they were relocated somewhere else. "Are you looking for a child here?" And my mother said immediately, "Oh, no, 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 I'm at the wrong building." And she turned around and left and went immediately to the hospital to see the doctor. And she told the doctor what happened. And he had underground connections with the Jewish underground. And somehow through the underground, he figured out, or they found out where we had been taken from the hospital, and which was like a stone quarry emptied out and filled with children now. And one of the young Jews dressed up as a Nazi, they had Nazi uniforms, and had the courage to come and pick us up at the stone quarry. This is how we got to my mother. Now, the building where my mother was given, the wife of the doctor had a brother who was fighting on the Russian front, and he had an apartment, but we could only go to the apartment if we were Christians. No Jews were allowed. So this is one of the reasons she said to my mother, "If you get the Christian birth certificates, then you can use my brother's apartment." And she gave the keys to my mother. So when my mother came back, she was about to pick us up and take us to that apartment, except we had been almost deported. So now we were in the building with her, and she thanked the young Jew, Nazi Jew, and he left. And she told us our new names. We had a different last name. Instead of Fabian, we were now called Poyak. I could keep my name because Erika was a good German name as well as Hungarian and Swedish. My sister had to be from Judith to become Edith because that was less Jewish sounding. And oddly enough, before we went upstairs, and to this day, I don't know why, she taught us the Christian Lord's Prayer. And she told us we were now Protestants, if anybody asked. And then she took us upstairs to, again, a first floor apartment. And she opened the door and Irene was there. So how much time do I have left, or any?
Just a couple minutes if you're able to.
Yeah, let me
finish.
summarize it. So that is where we spent the war with Irene and with my mother taking care of us in a Christian house with Christian kids, except when the war started really seriously in Hungary with the Russians and the Germans fighting for the city. Actually, the Russians were coming in to occupy the city. The German soldiers were defending it. So there was very heavy bombing. And despite all this, my mother was afraid to take us down to the basement, which was the safe place to be in case the building collapsed, because she was afraid that somehow we would give away the fact that we were Jewish. So when the building next door to us collapsed and our building shook like in an earthquake, I said to my mother, I know you're praying in Hebrew every night with Judith and Irene. I'm not stupid. And I have never given away the fact that we used to be Jewish and now we're Christian. So let's go to the basement before we have the building collapse on us. So she took me by my word and we went down to the basement. And that's where we spent actually the rest of the war, periodically coming out to go look for food and go stand in line and look for food. One of the incidents was my sister went with Irene to buy food at some point. And while they were standing on line, a young Nazi walked by, took a look at my sister and pointed at her and said, "That brat is Jewish." My sister looked Jewish, not really very Jewish, but still she had a straight nose. Mine was a turned up nose. So somebody could accuse her of that. She had big blue eyes and dark hair. She resembled my father and I resembled my mother. So the women of the building who were also standing on line with Irene and her started yelling at the Nazi and saying, "Are you crazy? We know the family and get out of here before we beat you up." You know, for the rest of the war, my sister either didn't go out, or if she had to go out, she covered up her face like we're covering our face now for the against the virus. Well, she covered her face. She was terrified. After the war was over, my mother discovered that my father will never come back. So she had to go to work and she didn't know what to do with us. We had no relatives left. All my grandparents were gone. Nobody. So she felt she didn't have a choice. She put us into an orphanage. Actually, first one orphanage the first year, which was a Zionist orphanage, which was great. But then Hungarians, then Israel was formed and Hungarians turned against the Zionists. So she had to take us out of there and put us into a real orphanage, mostly for Jewish kids, actually. And so we spent a year there, which was absolutely dreadful. And every time I ate anything, half the time I would throw it up. And I was either sick with a cold or had a stomach problem. My only joy was that the librarian let me read. We had a wonderful big bookcase full of books. And I learned to read when I was 3 years old because my sister was 6 years old. And my mother hired a special teacher for her so she could read better, because she started school at that time. And I sat in on her classes, so I learned to read too. So now at the orphanage, I read like a couple of books a week. And that actually was what sustained me emotionally. And in 1948, when I was 8 years old by then, and my sister was 11, my mother remarried. And we moved out of the orphanage into a home. And a couple of other things happened through our life, but that's another story. In 1956, we escaped from Hungary and were able to come to America, where I had a rabbi uncle who had survived Auschwitz. And right after the war was over, emigrated to America. So he sponsored us. And I was lucky. I was 16. I learned English. I didn't speak a word of English. I went to college in America. I got married at 19 and started traveling around the world for various reasons. And I worked in the theater for a number of years. And then I switched professions, became a world traveling writer and photographer, worked a couple of years for National Geographic. So that's my story.
Erika, you have done us the deepest, deepest honor by speaking to us this evening. Thank you so very much for your presence, for your heart, for sharing your photographic memory with us and telling us a bit about your life. And I think it has us all curious to learn more and to learn more about all of the accomplishments that came following the war. And as you said, for tonight, you'll speak about that part. And the deep curiosity comes from us to understand the rest. Yeah. Thank you for being with us so very much. And now I'd like to introduce Shelly Fox, who is going to sing for us the Zemlinsky song.
Auf braunem Sand mit Schuhen geht der Abend durch das müde Land. Mit stiller Fackel steckt nun der Sterne treue Kerzen an. Sei ruhig, Herz, sei ruhig. Das Dunkel kann dir nun kein Leid mehr tun, das Dunkel kein Leid mehr tun.
What a gift. What a gift, Erika, you gave all of us tonight. I was riveted by your story and inspired by your mother's ingenuity and your sister's strength and your stamina, and your belief and your hope in a different type of world. I want to offer a poem that's always been so meaningful to me called First They Came by Pastor Martin Niemoller. And Pastor Niemoller was a Protestant pastor. He was born in Lippstadt, Germany, and he lived from 1892 to 1984. And he emerged as an outspoken public enemy of Hitler. And he spent the last 7 years of Nazi rule in concentration camps himself. And he wrote the following poem. First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. And then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. In a moment, I would like to ask Susan Weil and Anatol Klebanov, as well as their children, Sam and Galina, to light 6 candles of memory, 6 candles for the 6 million Jews who died during the Shoah, during the Holocaust. Please, Anatol and Susan and Sam and Galina, please come forward.
We light these 6 candles in commemoration and to symbolize the 6 million Jews who perished, that they came from different ages. They came from different nationalities. They came from different forms of Jewish faith. They came from different genders. And now we light the candles in the wall.
In a moment, we're going to rise for El Malei Rachamim, the prayer in which we ask God to hold the souls of those who have departed. And I keep on thinking about Erika's mother's ingenuity and brilliance and flexibility and how she was able to hold her children and save them. And then I think with such a deep, wretched heart of all of those parents who weren't able to do that for their children. And so those of us who are able to rise, if you're able to rise, please rise and just hold gently all the souls of those who have passed, those who have perished, those who were horribly murdered during the Shoah. We rise.
שוכן במרומים, המציא מנוחה נכונה, תחת כנפי השכינה. כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים את נשמות יקירינו שהלכו בעל הרחמים יסתירם בסתר כנפיו לעולמים ויצרור בצרור החיים את שלום על משכבם ונאמר
Compassionate God, eternal Spirit of the universe, grant perfect rest in your sheltering presence to the 6 million Jews murdered at the hands of the Nazis, all of whom entered eternity. O God of mercy, let them find continual refuge in your eternal presence, in the shadow of your wings, and allow their souls to be held for eternity in the bond of everlasting life. God, you are inheritance. We pray that they rest in peace. We join together in Kaddish Yatom, the mourner's Kaddish. Please rise. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabba, ve'alma divrach irtei v'yamlich malchutei. V'chayechon u'v'yomechon u'v'chayei t'chol beit Yisrael v'agala u'v'zman kari v'imru. Amen. Yehi Shmei Rabbah Mevarach Le'olam Olam Me'omai Yitbarach V'yishtabach V'yitpa'ar V'yitchamam V'yitnaseh V'yitadar V'yitaleh V'yitalal Shmei Dekudasha B'richu La'ela Mikol Birchata V'shirata Tushpachata V'nechamata Da'amiran Be'alma V'imru Amen. Yehi Shlama Rabba Min Shemaya V'chaim Aleinu Ve'al Kol Yisrael V'imru Amen. Oseh Shalom B'imromav Hu Ya'aseh Shalom Aleinu Ve'al Kol Yisrael V'imru Amen. O God, who we call love and peace, we pray that we might all be held in love and peace, and that we might remember those lives lost with the fullness of our beings.
Tonight, we attempted to do the impossible. We attempted to remember, to honor all those who perished, to be present with the painful history, the real painful history of our people and of our world. And we want to thank primarily Erika, Fabian, for really giving of her heart and soul, and telling and speaking your truth. And we know that it was just part of your story. But what a gift you gave all of us tonight. And Emma Blankstein for introducing Erika. Thank you. And especially to Anatole Klevenow and Susan Weil and Bonnie Pastor and Ben Pomerantz for your ongoing support and your leadership always, every year when it comes to Yom HaShoah. Thank you. And I'd like to also thank my colleague, Rabbi Jocee Hudson, for really organizing this evening with Anatole and Susan and Bonnie and Ben, as well as Shelly Fox, our musical director. And thank you to our musicians tonight, Michael Alfera and Janice Mautner. It is the impossible that we've tried to touch and commemorate tonight. But this is what we can do right now. And your story, Erika, we will continue to hold on to and cherish and to tell to the next generation. So thank you.
In dem Beis Hamikdash, in a Winkel cheder, sitzt die Almone Bastion allein. Ihr ben Jochidel jedele, wird sie gesehen und singt ihm zum Schlafen a Liederle schön. Unter jedes Wiegele steht der chlorweiße Ziegele. Das Ziegele ist gefroren Handel. Das wird in den Beruf Rojinkes mit Mandeln. Schlaft jeder Schlaf. Unter jedes Siedele sollst du sich Dämonen Liedele Rojinkes mit Mandeln. Das wird in den Beruf. Jede Lebe da
Just as you came in peace, may you go in peace. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Erev Tov. May this be a powerful day and an important day of remembering for all of us.